The cabin lights glowed a soft gold as passengers filed onto Flight 718, a late evening run from Atlanta to New York. Outside the oval windows, the runway shimmered in a thin mist, but inside first class the air smelled of polished leather and fresh coffee. A low hum of conversation mixed with the muted chime of boarding announcements. Seat 1A waited in the front corner of the cabin, wide, immaculate, and already claimed by a man who looked as if he belonged in a boardroom more than an airplane. David Carter adjusted the cuff of his black suit, the fabric crisp against the white of his shirt. A deep red tie cut through the muted colors around him like a quiet signal of power. He rested a sleek leather briefcase at his feet and exhaled a calm breath. Then, sharp and sudden, a cold voice sliced through the cabin. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside. Hold on with me for a second. Imagine you're holding a confirmed first-class ticket, dressed for a history-making deal, and a stranger orders you out of your seat. Please hit subscribe right now so this story can reach more people and spark real awareness. Your click helps others learn and speak out when injustice hides behind polite smiles. And drop a comment with where you're watching from. Would you stay silent or speak up?" The flight attendant in a tailored navy jacket and bright blue scarf stood over David. Her smile was tight, almost mechanical, but the edge in her tone left no doubt. This was an order, not a request. David looked up, calm but puzzled. His ticket, first class, confirmed, lay neatly on the tray table. He tapped it once with a finger. "There must be a mistake," he said evenly. "There's been a seating change," the attendant replied, eyes flicking toward a tall white man lingering just behind her. "Please collect your belongings." The hedge fund manager in the aisle clutched a leather carry-on, gaze fixed on the seat like a hawk watching prey. Around them, whispers began to ripple. A phone camera clicked. David felt the weight of 100 unseen eyes. He could have raised his voice. He could have demanded a supervisor. Instead, he reached slowly for his briefcase, the silver of his watch glinting beneath the cabin lights. Inside, his phone waited, its camera ready to capture every detail. As he rose, the cabin fell into a hush so complete that even the engine's low rumble seemed to pause. What the passengers, and the airline, did next would change more than a single flight. Before the chaos of that night became a headline, before hashtags and stock crashes, there was simply a man in a black suit moving through Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport like a shadow with purpose. His name was David Carter, 42 years old, Chicago-born, and the quiet kind of powerful that never needs to announce itself. No entourage. No assistant juggling calls. Just a sleek leather briefcase in one hand and a direct gaze that told you he'd already weighed every move in the room. David had built his fortune the way some people build cities, one careful brick at a time. A decade ago he coded a payment software in a South Side apartment, eating takeout noodles while servers crashed. Now, his tech company handled billions in transactions for banks, airlines, and governments. Industry blogs called him the invisible architect of modern finance. But he preferred something simpler: father, innovator, strategist. Money didn't excite him. Influence did. And tonight, influence was exactly what he carried onto Flight 718. Yet if you had seen him that evening, you might not have recognized any of that. Dressed in a sharp black suit and a crisp white shirt that caught the overhead lights, he looked more like a professor on a late commute than a man about to finalize a $700 million airline partnership. No flashy watch. No designer logo. The only sign of his leverage was the subtle red tie, a quiet flash of defiance against the sea of business blues. At the security checkpoint, a TSA agent gave his boarding pass an extra glance. "Random check," the agent said, voice light but eyes calculating. David smiled politely, stepping aside without argument. Inside, he noted the pattern. Random. Always random. He'd heard that word too many times in too many airports. But tonight he let it pass. He had a bigger game to play. Why commercial instead of a private jet? David insisted on it. 4 months he'd been studying the airline's operations, testing everything from booking glitches to baggage claims. Flying first class tonight wasn't luxury, it was reconnaissance. He wanted to see the service ordinary passengers received, even those who carried first-class tickets. What he didn't know was how far operational necessity would stretch when a black man occupied seat 1A. As he walked down the jet bridge, the smell of jet fuel and burnt coffee mixed in the cool night air. A soft ding from his phone lit up the inside of his briefcase. A single message from his legal team: deal ready. Sign in New York. He slid the phone back without reply. David stepped onto the aircraft, unaware that every careful decision of his career, every sleepless night, every quiet triumph, was about to be tested by a single sentence from a stranger in uniform. And just as he reached the first-class cabin, a shadow moved behind him. Someone was watching. Someone who would make sure this flight was anything but routine. The night air outside Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson carried the scent of jet fuel and damp concrete as boarding calls echoed through the vast terminal. Overhead speakers hummed with gate changes and last-minute warnings, but at gate C-27, time seemed to slow. A late-night flight to New York usually meant tired business travelers and quiet families, but tonight every small movement felt loaded. Malik Carter adjusted the cuff of his sharp black suit, leather briefcase in hand, and stepped into the priority lane. His boarding pass flashed first class in bold letters, but the gate agent's eyes lingered a fraction too long on his face before scanning it. A polite smile never reached her eyes. "One moment, sir." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as if searching for a hidden problem. The pause stretched. Passengers behind him shifted impatiently. Then, with a forced grin, she waved him through. "Have you ever felt a welcome so thin you could hear it crack?" Malik did. He moved forward, each step a quiet test of patience. At the jet bridge, a second agent stopped him again. "Random check, sir." "Just routine." The words random and routine carried a weight anyone who's ever been singled out understands. Malik offered his ID without a word. The agent gave it a quick glance, then nodded him on. Inside the aircraft, the air smelled of fresh coffee and recirculated cabin heat. Passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, phones glowing like small lanterns. Malik's seat, 1A, sat in the far left corner, a small island of privacy. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt eyes. A man in a navy blazer gave a slow once-over, then whispered something to the woman beside him. Their muffled laughter died when Malik's gaze met theirs. Another pause at the galley. A flight attendant with perfectly pinned hair gave a polite but puzzled double-take at his ticket. "First class?" she asked, the question rising like a challenge rather than confirmation. Malik answered with a calm nod. "Seat 1A." She pressed her lips into a thin smile and stepped aside. Small moments, each easy to dismiss, stacked like cards. The extra ID check, the whispered side glances, the hesitant smiles. Alone, they might be coincidence. Together, they felt like a pattern. Have you ever wondered if people see you, or the story they've been told about you? As Malik slid into the soft leather seat, he caught a glimpse of a tall white man lingering near the entrance, holding a ticket but making no move to sit. Their eyes met for half a heartbeat before the man looked away, his jaw tight. The attendant who had just checked Malik's ticket whispered something to a colleague, her brows knitting in silent calculation. The cabin door hissed shut, but tension hung heavier than the recycled air. Malik rested his briefcase beside him and tightened his grip on the armrest. Something in the crew's quiet exchange told him this flight was far from routine. And when the intercom crackled to life with an unscheduled chime, he knew the night was about to change. The seatbelt sign was still off when the tension snapped. A sharp chime cut through the low murmur of boarding passengers, followed by a voice both polite and unyielding. "Sir," the flight attendant said, her navy blazer pressed to perfection, "I'm going to need you to step aside." Every sound around seat 1A seemed to fade, the shuffle of carry-ons, the hiss of air vents, until only that single command remained. David Carter looked up from his phone, the glow of the screen catching the silver of his watch. His boarding pass rested on the tray in plain view. "First class." "Confirmed." "Paid in full." "There must be a mistake," he replied, voice calm but edged with quiet authority. "This is my seat." The attendant's smile didn't waver, but the corners of her mouth tightened. "There's been a seating change," she said. The word change landed like a slap. Her eyes flicked toward a tall white passenger waiting in the aisle, his designer blazer crisp as a bank ledger. He avoided David's gaze, clutching a leather carry-on as if the seat belonged to him by birthright. Phones lifted, subtle but deliberate. A whisper rippled across the cabin. "What's happening?" Someone's camera lens caught the faint tremor in David's hand as he tapped the edge of his ticket. "Security can explain if you'd prefer," the attendant added, tone soft but sharpened by policy. "Operational necessity, random reassignment." Words the airline loved, words that covered everything and explained nothing. David exhaled slowly, every breath a calculation. He thought of the $700 million partnership waiting in New York, the lawyers already preparing champagne. He thought of the word discretion, the one every executive hides behind when bias slips through a smile. He pressed the record button on his phone. The hedge fund manager stepped forward. No apology, no hesitation, just a smooth slide into 1A, as if the seat had always been his. The attendant leaned closer to David, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "Sir, please. For everyone's experience." Experience? Another corporate shield. David stood, adjusting the cuff of his black suit with deliberate care. He lifted his leather briefcase, the soft creak of the handle the only sound in the sudden hush. Passengers watched but said nothing. A few lowered their eyes. Others kept filming. As David stepped into the aisle, a man in the second row muttered under his breath, just loud enough to carry. "Unbelievable." Whether it was sympathy or scorn, no one could tell. The attendant gestured toward the back. "This way, please." David's voice stayed even. "I'll go where you ask," he said, "but I'll need your name." Her eyes flickered, just a flash, before she gave it. He repeated it clearly for the recording. The cabin door sealed with a heavy thud, but the real pressure was still building. Behind David, the man now reclining in 1A smirked, unaware that every second of this quiet humiliation was being documented. And as David moved toward coach, a new sound cut through the silence. The captain's intercom clicking on, followed by a pause so long it felt like the plane itself was holding its breath. The aisle felt narrower than when David first boarded. The soft leather of his briefcase pressed against his leg as two uniformed airline staff approached. One in a navy blazer, another in a gray vest marked security. Neither raised their voice, but their presence carried the quiet finality of an order. "Sir," the gray-vested man said, "please gather your belongings. We'll assist you to another seat." No explanation. No apology. Just the phrase "assist you," the corporate code for remove you. Passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to stare while angling their phones for a better shot. A woman in 2C caught David's eye and mouthed a silent sorry. He gave a slight nod, calm and measured. David slipped his phone into recording mode, screen dimmed to a discreet glow. The red timer began to count, silent proof of every word and movement. "May I know why?" he asked, his tone steady, almost gentle. "It's an operational necessity," the attendant replied, each syllable polished but cold. "Your experience will still be our priority." Operational necessity. Experience. Corporate buzzwords dressed as respect. David's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I understand," he said, though the words carried a quiet challenge. The hedge fund passenger, tall, pale, blazer crisp as a boardroom contract, slipped into seat 1A without meeting David's gaze. He adjusted the headrest as though sealing a deal, fingers tapping a rhythm of entitlement. "Have you ever been told you don't belong, even when the proof is right in your hand?" David felt the sting, but his composure never cracked. The security officer gestured down the aisle. "This way, sir." David stood, adjusting the cuff of his black suit with deliberate precision. Each movement, lifting the briefcase, tucking the boarding pass into his pocket, was slow enough to make every camera follow. The quiet clicks of recording phones filled the cabin like hidden applause. As he stepped into coach, the air grew warmer, heavier with recycled heat and quiet whispers. A child peeked over a seat back. A college student muttered, "Unbelievable," half under his breath. David kept walking, every step a statement of control. A flight attendant in economy, her face softer than the others, leaned close as he passed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes flicking nervously toward the front. "This isn't right." David gave a small nod, voice low but firm. "Please remember what you saw." He slid into an aisle seat near the middle of the cabin, the hum of engines masking the soft buzz of his recording phone. He typed a short text to an unknown contact. "Record everything. Meeting still on." The plane shuddered as the door sealed. Lights dimmed to a muted glow. Passengers settled, but the tension clung like static. Somewhere beyond the cockpit door, a decision was brewing, one that could shift the balance of power before the wheels ever left the ground. Then the intercom cracked to life with a sharp chime. The pause. A breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, voice tight with something more than routine, "to the gentleman moved from first class, please remain after landing." The cabin froze. And David's faint smile returned. The cabin lights dimmed to a muted amber as Flight 718 cut smoothly through the night sky. From his cramped aisle seat in coach, David Carter rested his black briefcase across his knees like a shield. The air smelled faintly of reheated pasta and burnt coffee, but underneath lingered something sharper, anxiety. Around him, passengers whispered in hushed tones, their words soft enough to hide but loud enough to sting. A young woman too rose up, angled her phone just enough to catch a covert shot. A man across the aisle mouthed a silent wow to his companion. No one spoke to David directly. No one asked if he was okay. They only stared, eyes flicking between the tall black man in a tailored suit and the luxury seat he'd been forced to surrender. A soft rustle came from the galley. One flight attendant, a woman with tired eyes and a silver pin on her lapel, stepped quietly into the aisle. She glanced around, making sure her supervisor wasn't near, and crouched beside David's armrest. Her voice barely rose above the hum of the engines. "I'm sorry about what happened," she whispered. "This isn't protocol. They called it an operational necessity, but..." She trailed off, swallowing the rest of the sentence. Her gaze darted to the front cabin, where the hedge fund passenger reclined in David's rightful seat, a champagne flute balanced carelessly in his hand. "Why?" David asked, his tone even but sharp. The attendant's lips pressed together. "I can't say. Please, just know not everyone agrees with this." Then she disappeared as quickly as she came, leaving only the faint scent of citrus lotion and 1,000 unspoken questions. David exhaled slowly and slid his phone from his jacket pocket. With a quick swipe, the camera app opened, its red record icon glowing like a warning light. He angled the lens toward the forward cabin, capturing faces, name tags, and every careless gesture of entitlement. The soft click of screenshots punctuated the drone of the engines. A vibration buzzed against his palm. A message from an encrypted contact flashed across the screen. "Meeting confirmed. Record everything." David typed a single reply, "Already ahead of you." Then he locked the phone and rested it on the briefcase, his expression unreadable. The man in 1A raised his glass and smirked as if sensing nothing more than an empty victory. David leaned back, eyes half closed. But inside, calculations fired like quiet sparks, names to remember, evidence to secure, consequences to unleash. The passengers around him shifted uneasily, drawn to the stillness of a man planning something they couldn't imagine. The intercom crackled suddenly, the captain's voice cutting through the quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have a special message for one of our passengers upon arrival." The cabin froze. Heads turned. And David's eyes opened, sharp and steady. What kind of message waits for a man who refuses to be humiliated twice? The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime, but the cabin didn't relax. A low tension hung in the air, the kind you can almost taste, like metal on the tongue. David Carter sat in coach now, his black suit still crisp, the white shirt bright under the dimmed lights. He looked like a man waiting for a meeting, not a victim of a humiliating downgrade. He slid his phone back into his pocket, calm, unreadable. Passengers stole quick glances at him, whispering behind raised magazines. Some pretended to watch the in-flight movie, but their eyes kept flicking toward the tall black man who'd been removed from first class. A mother hushed her curious child. A businessman shifted uncomfortably, as if silence might protect him from complicity. Then, the intercom crackled. A single breathless pause followed, a space so brief and heavy it made hearts skip. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came, lower than the usual cheerful script. "To the gentleman who was reassigned from first class, please remain on board after landing. Corporate management requests a private word." The cabin froze. Heads turned in unison toward David. Even the flight attendants stiffened. A flight like this rarely carried mystery, and now everyone was part of one. David didn't move. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, eyes steady on the seat back in front of him. His calm was unnerving, almost electric. If anyone expected anger, they were met with something colder, quiet calculation. A young attendant approached, her professional smile trembling. "Sir, can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" David met her eyes with a polite nod. "Water's fine. Thank you." Her cheeks flushed as she retreated, aware that everyone was watching. From the first-class cabin, a shadow moved. The hedge fund passenger who had taken David's seat stood briefly to stretch, then sat again with a smirk that landed like a slap. David noticed but didn't react. His silence carried more weight than any argument. Inside his mind, details clicked into place. Names, time stamps, the captain's voice, the company logo stitched on every uniform. Every second was evidence. He tapped a brief text to a contact labeled only as boardroom. "Captain just made announcement. Keep line open." Above the hum of engines, a new question began to circulate among the passengers. Who exactly was this man in the black suit, and why did corporate management suddenly care? The mother with the curious child whispered to her seatmate, "He must be someone important." Her neighbor replied, "Important enough to make the captain speak. But why did they move him at all?" David leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the speculation feed itself. Every passing mile tightened the invisible leash around the airline's reputation. Then a faint chime signaled the crew's private interphone. A male attendant hurried down the aisle, pale and tight-lipped, and slipped into the cockpit. Moments later, the captain's voice returned, clipped and urgent. But this time, it wasn't for the passengers. It was for David alone. "Mr. Carter," he said, using a name no one had spoken aloud, "please remain seated. We'll speak after landing." The cabin gasped. How did the captain know his name? And what exactly awaited him behind that locked cockpit door when the wheels touched down at JFK? David sat in the dimly lit aisle seat, the soft hum of the plane's engines vibrating through the cabin. Around him, the murmur of passengers and the occasional clink of a coffee cup felt distant, almost irrelevant. He didn't fidget or glance nervously. Instead, he drew his phone from the breast pocket of his jacket, the screen illuminating his focused expression. Every frame of the footage he had recorded earlier played back in meticulous detail. The flight attendant's subtle glance, the hedge fund passenger's smug adjustment of his tie, the silent, almost imperceptible reactions of other first-class travelers. He watched quietly, zooming in on name tags, small insignias, badges, anything that could tell him who had been involved, who had looked the other way, and who had actively participated in the slight against him. Every detail mattered, because he had learned that power often hid in the shadows, in the decisions made without witnesses, and in the casual assumptions of those who believed their authority was unchallenged. The calm in his face, the stillness in his hands, belied a mind working with the precision of a chess master. As he traced the subtle movements of the cabin crew and passengers, a faint crackle of the intercom drew his attention. Not the captain's voice this time, just the low, consistent background noise that reminded him of altitude and distance. He let the noise linger, listening as he evaluated each moment for inconsistencies, for evidence, for anything that suggested negligence, or worse, intentional bias. In his calm, almost eerie quiet, he seemed untouchable, yet every observer around him, even those seated inches away, would sense that something was different. Something deliberate. The faces in his footage told a story. Some had a flash of embarrassment, a quick attempt to avert eyes, but none dared speak. The power of observation, he knew, was sometimes stronger than confrontation. By recording without comment, by capturing without accusation, he ensured that truth would speak louder than anger. And truth, in this case, was already forming a storm that no apology could contain. He allowed himself a slight breath, a momentary pause, then tapped through the next sequence. The white passenger, still adjusting to the comfort of a seat that was never his, offered the smallest of smirks toward a fellow traveler, oblivious to the storm brewing just a few rows back. David's gaze lingered, and in that stillness, the weight of what was coming settled in his chest. He didn't fume, didn't yell, didn't wave anyone down. His strategy was patience. His power was quiet, almost surgical, and the airline had no idea just how much they had underestimated him. Even as he reviewed the final clip, the subtle nods between flight attendants, the whispered apologies meant to be unseen, he felt an almost chilling sense of satisfaction. Not because of revenge, not because of spite, but because the ledger of disrespect was now meticulously documented, and every subtle act of disregard would be accounted for in ways the airline could not yet imagine. A subtle vibration signaled a new message on his phone. He did not immediately look at it. Instead, he observed the cabin once more, the passengers' oblivious chatter, the overhead screens flickering with the in-flight safety video, the faint hiss of recycled air. Everything was normal. Everything appeared routine. Yet in the quiet corners of the plane, the balance of power had already begun to shift. David finally opened the message. It contained only 3 words: "Prepare for landing." Nothing else. No explanation, no urgency. And yet, the simplicity of those words sent a ripple through his mind. The storm he had been quietly building was about to hit a new phase, one that none of the crew, and certainly none of the passengers, would see coming. And just as the seatbelt signs blinked on, signaling descent, David's phone buzzed again. This time, the sender was unknown. A single notification, a single cryptic line: "They know who you are now." For a moment, he simply stared, letting the words sink in. Then he smiled faintly, calm, collected, but behind that calm, a quiet, calculated fire was growing. The airline had no idea that their next mistake would not just be embarrassing, it would be catastrophic. And with that, the plane tilted slightly, engines humming louder as it began its final approach, carrying David, and the secret he held, straight toward the moment that would change everything. The plane's wheels screeched softly against the tarmac, tires kissing the concrete with a dull, persistent rhythm. Around David, passengers began unfastening seatbelts, gathering bags, checking phones. Yet he remained seated, calm as if the chaotic landing and bustling terminal existed in a different plane of reality. His eyes scanned the cabin, noting who avoided his gaze, who whispered to a neighbor, who fumbled with their boarding passes. Every movement was catalogued, every glance stored for later review. As the cabin door slid open, a subtle shift in the air announced a new phase of this unfolding story. 2 men in sharp, tailored suits waited at the jetway, just beyond the exit, their postures stiff, their expressions taut. One wiped a clammy palm across his tie, the other adjusted his jacket, the kind of mechanical movements that revealed nerves they were desperate to hide. Neither had yet registered the gravity of who they were confronting. To the casual eye, they were just corporate executives waiting for a VIP. But to David, they were the gatekeepers of the very deal that had been reduced, in less than an hour, to precarious uncertainty. They spotted him, and their smiles appeared first forced, then slightly faltering. "Mr. Carter," one said, his voice carefully even, "we'd like a word if you have a moment." There was a tremor in the words, betraying the fear that his presence, calm, unshaken and meticulously observant, already inspired. David's lips curved into the faintest of nods. He didn't rush, didn't speak, didn't reveal more than necessary. The quiet confidence he carried was a language they couldn't read. They walked with him toward the private lounge, an area usually reserved for passengers who flew unnoticed, whose business cards didn't command attention on Wall Street or in the boardroom. Here, there were no distractions, no murmuring travelers, no flashing cameras. Just the stark contrast between control and the illusion of it. The executives led the way, chairs scraping softly against polished floors, and David followed, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes tracking every movement. Once seated, the air thickened with anticipation. The executives leaned forward, hands clasped, each trying to project authority while their shoulders betrayed tension. Who wanted to apologize for any inconvenience you experienced on the flight. One began, each word carefully measured. It was never our intention. His voice faltered, as if apologizing to someone who had every right to retaliate was an alien concept. David didn't respond immediately. He studied them, the small beads of sweat, the twitch of an eye, the almost imperceptible tightening of a jaw. Every detail, every micro-expression told him far more than words could. He allowed a pause, letting the silence amplify the weight of the moment. Then, with the gentlest inflection, he said, "You'll hear from my team. No more. No anger, no lecture, no immediate retaliation, just a measured statement that carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen far more than anyone in the room could imagine." The executive's expressions shifted in real time. Relief? Confusion? Fear? Perhaps a combination of all three. They understood, instinctively, that this was no ordinary passenger dispute. They were in the presence of a man whose quiet power could dismantle more than pride. It could dismantle contracts, reputations, and fortunes. A shadow of unease passed between them. One executive leaned slightly closer, voice lowered. "We will await your team's guidance, sir." David inclined his head slightly, his calm exterior masking the strategic storm already forming behind his eyes. They had no idea just how far this would reach, or how the tape in his phone would echo through their offices, their boardrooms, their corporate lives. As he rose to leave the lounge, the faint hum of the city beyond the terminal felt distant. Every step carried the weight of quiet vengeance and measured justice. Outside, the world moved as usual, travelers collecting luggage, taxis lining up, airport announcements threading through the background. Inside, however, a private reckoning was already taking shape, a storm that had been quietly documented at 30,000 feet, now descending to the ground. And just as David stepped toward the elevator that would take him to the awaiting black car, his phone vibrated again. The screen displayed a single, cryptic notification. "They're starting to panic." A subtle smile touched his lips, and in that instant, the audience realizes the storm is about to become public. But how the airline, the executives, and Wall Street will respond is a question that hangs, sharp and dangerous, in the air. The doors of the VIP lounge closed behind David with a soft click, cutting off the low hum of airport announcements and the shuffle of travelers. The space was stark, almost sterile, lined with muted leather chairs and polished wood panels. Outside, the city of New York carried on its ceaseless rhythm, but inside, time slowed. Every second felt deliberately measured, a beat stretched between expectation and fear. The two airline executives, men who had walked past the luxury and chaos of their corporate world only to be rendered nearly powerless, stood stiffly, hands hovering over the arms of their chairs as if gripping them would anchor them to confidence they no longer possessed. "Mr. Carter," one said, voice tight, almost shaking, "we need to explain what happened. It was never our intention for you to be moved." "Security," he paused, swallowed, tried again. "It was just a procedural, an operational necessity. A random reassignment, nothing personal." The words hung in the air like smoke, fragile and unconvincing. David didn't immediately respond. His eyes were calm, almost empty in their neutrality, yet they pierced through the thin veneer of excuses. Every twitch of their lips, every shallow breath, every hesitation was noted, stored, and evaluated. They could sense it. He wasn't just listening. He was calculating, understanding, weighing consequences far beyond what either executive could see. The silence he held was more potent than any words of anger could have been. "I understand," he finally said, voice even measured. There was no inflection of outrage, no flare of indignation, only a careful neutrality that made them lean in closer, searching for the storm that had been promised but remained restrained. "But understand this," he continued, slow, deliberate, "you will hear from my team." The line landed softly, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. It was a promise that actions, not words, would define the response. The executives shifted uncomfortably. The first attempted to salvage composure. "We assure you, Mr. Carter, The incident does not reflect our company values. Your experience, it was unfortunate. Our staff, his voice faltered, words collapsing under the gravity of the man before him. David's gaze never wavered. He didn't need to speak further. His quiet authority did more damage than any confrontation could. There was a moral tension in the room, a question hanging between them. Should they beg further, attempt persuasion, or retreat into the safe shadows of corporate excuses? Neither choice seemed viable. David's calm made every option appear desperate, even absurd. He did not rise, did not raise his voice, did not demand apologies. Silence, it seemed, was his weapon. Every heartbeat of restraint made the executives feel smaller, powerless, exposed. Outside the lounge window, the taxi line moved with routine oblivion. The world kept spinning, unknowing, but inside, the consequences of one airline's oversight and one CEO's silent fury were already taking shape. The executives glanced at each other, unspoken panic passing in their eyes. The incident had begun as a personal humiliation but now carried the potential to ripple across contracts, stock reports, and corporate reputations. David's phone vibrated lightly in his pocket, the screen flashing a single message. They're on edge. Proceed. He read it, and without a word, the tension shifted. A quiet smile brushed across his lips, almost imperceptible, the kind that hinted at storms brewing in boardrooms, behind glass walls, far beyond this lounge. The executives, still fumbling, had no idea that in the next 48 hours, the magnitude of this single flight would become public. They did not yet realize that a simple nod, a measured pause, and a cryptic line had set in motion a sequence of events that could cost them millions, perhaps even their reputations. David rose, the lounge suddenly too small, too exposed. And as he stepped toward the door, the narrative was far from over. Outside, cameras and phones would soon capture what they never expected, proof that silence and dignity could command consequences far heavier than outrage. But in this moment, the executives were left with only a chilling question. How much power can a quiet man really hold, and are they about to witness it firsthand? The glass walls of David Carter's Chicago office reflected the city skyline like a mirror of quiet inevitability. Outside, the early afternoon sun glinted off neighboring towers, oblivious to the storm brewing within these walls. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, almost fragile. His legal team sat around the long, polished table, papers neatly stacked, laptops open, coffee cups half forgotten. Each attorney knew that nothing in their careers had prepared them for a decision of this magnitude. A single instruction from one man, and a $700 million contract, the culmination of months of negotiations, could vanish as if it had never existed. David stood at the head of the table, calm and measured. His eyes tracked the flicker of images on his phone once more, the flight attendant's tightened smile, the hedge fund passenger's smug glance, the moment security escorted him from first class. Every detail was catalogued, every expression analyzed. He didn't speak immediately, letting the tension build like a slow drumbeat across the room. The lawyers shifted, sensing that this was more than a meeting, it was a reckoning. Finally, David's voice cut through the silence, steady, deliberate. Terminate the contract. No hesitation. No preamble. Just the words, heavy with authority, heavy with consequence. A soft murmur rippled around the table. One attorney's hand hovered above a laptop, unsure whether to click, send, or hesitate, but the direction was absolute. Terminate. Every clause, every signature, every preliminary handshake rendered irrelevant by this single, unyielding decision. The room seemed to pause. Outside, the city hummed with routine life, office workers rushing, traffic weaving, oblivious to the fact that billions of dollars were being redirected by the decisions of one man. Inside, the weight of history pressed down. This wasn't just business, it was power exercised with precision, dignity, and a silent refusal to be humiliated again. Do you understand the implications? One lawyer finally asked, voice low, tinged with disbelief. This deal is larger than the airline's quarterly profit. Their stock, their projections, this could destabilize them financially. David's expression remained unchanged. He didn't need to explain, the room understood. Humiliation had met consequence. Racism had met accountability. Silence had met a storm. He folded his hands, leaning slightly forward. I don't need apologies. I need results. Execute. And ensure this reaches the top. Every board member. Every executive. They will understand the cost of their choices. Phones buzzed. Emails pinged. Digital signatures awaited termination. Every action taken in these moments would echo through corporate corridors and investor reports, reaching far beyond the polished glass of this office. David's mind, however, was elsewhere. He reflected on the flight, the subtle indignities, the quiet stares. The lesson was simple: power unrecognized could be costly. Respect ignored could be devastating. And those who believed themselves untouchable? They were about to learn that dignity, even when silent, commanded consequences. The attorneys worked quickly, every motion deliberate. Yet despite the efficiency, attention lingered, a question no one dared voice aloud. What would the airline do once the news hit? How far would this ripple extend? David, standing by the window, watching the city below, felt the calm before the storm, the moment where preparation meets inevitability. The quiet satisfaction of someone who had turned humiliation into leverage, patience into power. And as the first email confirming termination was sent, an unspoken truth settled in the room. This was no longer about business alone. This was about respect, consequence, and the reminder that even in elite spaces, subtle prejudice carried a cost far greater than anyone imagined. But outside, beyond the office and the glass walls, the world would only begin to see the scale of this reckoning, and the question remained: how badly would the airline pay for underestimating him? By morning, the world had already woken to a story it couldn't ignore. David Carter's quiet, calculated response to the humiliation on Flight 718 had leaked. Someone, an anonymous source, perhaps a passenger, perhaps an insider, uploaded the footage online, and the clip exploded across social media like a shockwave. The first frames showed the subtle tension: a flight attendant's tight-lipped instructions, David's calm composure as he was guided from first class, the white hedge fund manager sliding smugly into his seat. Then the real power play: David, recording, observing, his eyes cold but composed, a man who had already begun rewriting the rules. Within hours, hashtags began trending. Hashtag First Class Black climbed the charts, followed closely by hashtag 700M lesson, each post inviting outrage, debate, and disbelief. People shared their personal stories. Quiet indignities endured on flights, subtle racism in corporate spaces, the feeling of being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. Viewers were captivated, enraged, and heartbroken, all at once. Comment sections filled with judgment, reflection, and moral confrontation. Some called it long overdue accountability, others debated whether David had overreacted. Was it racism, pure arrogance, or both intertwined in ways most people couldn't untangle? News outlets caught wind of the frenzy, blurring the lines between social media outrage and mainstream reporting. Early morning talk shows replayed the footage, dissecting it frame by frame. Anchors questioned airline executives, corporate analysts predicted market implications, and pundits debated whether this single incident could ripple through an entire industry. David remained invisible in all of it. No interviews, no statements, no self-promotion. His silence amplified the chaos, an absence that spoke louder than any press release could. People were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. Respect denied could carry consequences far beyond expectations. Even outside the business world, the discussion grew personal. Families shared the clip at breakfast tables, friends debated it in coffee shops, and colleagues whispered about it in elevators. The moral questions were unavoidable. How would you respond if this happened to you? Could dignity coexist with power without being exploited? Could a single act of quiet observation shift an entire industry? Viewers were caught in the tension between admiration and disbelief, and the algorithm ensured that the story traveled further, faster, and louder than anyone anticipated. On Twitter, some voices demanded justice, urging the public to hold the airline accountable. Others questioned the role of privilege and entitlement, dissecting each microaggression, each coded word, each subtle bias in the cabin. Commenters argued fiercely, typing from offices, living rooms, and hotel lobbies across the country. It was no longer just a flight. It was a lesson, a warning, a mirror reflecting systemic inequities in elite spaces. The clips circulated endlessly, replayed, paused, zoomed in, screenshots taken, tweets copied. Every view became a witness, every reaction a ripple in a conversation that was impossible to ignore. And yet, amid all the clamor, David's calm remained unshaken. He watched the numbers rise quietly from an undisclosed location, knowing that power was rarely loud. Influence could be felt even when invisible, and humiliation could be converted into leverage in ways that stunned observers. But just as the world began to reckon with the footage, just as the hashtags went global, a new notification appeared on his phone, a message from someone inside the airline. Its content was cryptic, urgent, and carried the promise of immediate consequences that even David hadn't yet anticipated. The screen blinked, and the message read, "They're calling an emergency board meeting. You need to see this, now." By mid-morning, the fallout was undeniable. Screens across financial networks flickered with the stark reality: the airline's stock had nosedived. Analysts called it unprecedented, a sudden, public relations crisis triggered not by a scandal in the boardroom, but by one man's quiet defiance at 30,000 feet. The numbers were brutal, flashing red across tickers, and investors were scrambling. Traders muttered over phones, the same phrases repeating: unforced error, brand damage, executive negligence. Inside the airline's headquarters, panic was palpable. The CEO paced the glass-walled conference room, fingers drumming against his temple. Press releases were drafted, discarded, and redrafted, each one trying to capture contrition without admitting deeper fault. Behind closed doors, employees whispered nervously in hallways, sharing snippets of the footage they had seen online. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others feared that the subtle prejudices they had long tolerated were now public, visible, undeniable. The incident quickly earned a nickname within the company: the Atlanta incident. It was a phrase heavy with shame, murmured cautiously in cubicles and lounges alike, like a warning to anyone who had ever crossed a line or looked the other way. Meanwhile, protests began to form outside major hubs. Activists and travelers organized in front of gates, holding signs that demanded accountability. Hashtag First Class While Black still trended, carried by a tide of outrage and solidarity. Passengers arriving at airports whispered to one another, pointing out the faces in the viral footage, sharing opinions, and debating what justice meant in this new context. The airline's usual rhythm of flights, check-ins, and announcements now carried an undercurrent of tension. Every boarding call, every announcement, every crew movement felt heavier, as if the cabin itself was aware of the storm outside. Yet David Carter remained distant from it all, unseen, his presence felt only through the ripples of consequence he had set in motion. He did not need to speak. The silence he maintained was a statement louder than any press conference could ever be. His measured absence conveyed the weight of his dignity, the deliberate restraint of someone who understood that power often worked most effectively when hidden, when felt rather than displayed. And as employees whispered and journalists speculated, a subtle, uneasy energy settled in. David had taught a lesson without a word, and the airline knew it would be remembered long after the cameras were turned off. The city hummed with reactions, calls to action, and speculation about the long-term repercussions. But even as the boardroom scrambled and social media churned, a new notification blinked across David's phone. A name he had not expected, one tied directly to the airline's inner circle, sent a message with 3 simple words: "We're not done." The calm that had defined David's calculated response now met its first real test of public backlash. And in the distance, far above the chaos, the next move was already forming, one that could turn this already explosive story into something far more consequential. David Carter's office was quiet, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass walls of his Chicago headquarters. The sunlight hit the polished surfaces, reflecting off the awards and plaques that chronicled years of calculated success. But none of that mattered in that moment. His phone had stopped buzzing hours ago, the emails had slowed, Yet the ripples of what had happened in Atlanta still spread like an invisible storm across the corporate world. He leaned back, folding his hands over the leather briefcase that had accompanied him on every step of the journey. The flight, the humiliation, the careful observation, it had all led to this. Within 48 hours, a $700 million contract had been terminated. A single act of disrespect, a moment of prejudice in first class, had triggered consequences the airline could neither predict nor control. The irony was not lost on anyone watching the fallout, and David, for all his power, had let silence speak louder than confrontation. In boardrooms and lounges across the country, employees whispered about the Atlanta incident, a phrase now charged with fear and shame. The airline scrambled, its stock remained volatile, and the executives who had once looked down on him now faced a reckoning that had nothing to do with negotiations or balance sheets. David's decision had been surgical, precise, and entirely quiet, a lesson in operational discretion that few outside his inner circle could fully comprehend. Yet it wasn't just about the money or the public embarrassment. It was a statement, one that spoke to the deeper currents of systemic prejudice hidden in the elite spaces he navigated daily. The world had witnessed a man treated as less than, not because of incompetence, but because of the color of his skin. And yet, the power to reshape the narrative had always rested with him. He had chosen how it was wielded, and in that quiet, deliberate choice, he reminded the world that dignity and patience could be more devastating than outrage. As the news cycles churned and hashtags trended across social media, David considered the questions left unanswered. Would the airline change its policies? Would the microaggressions cease? Or would this incident fade, a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors while the real systems remained intact? For him, the work was unfinished, not because of revenge, but because the challenge of justice was ongoing. Silence, when properly leveraged, could teach lessons louder than words, but it was also a call for vigilance, for awareness, for action. And now, as the day drew to a close, a subtle ping alerted him to another message. It was brief and signed, but loaded. Next flight. Same playbook. Be ready. The reminder was clear. His influence had reached further than even he had anticipated, and the next opportunity to act, to observe, to teach, was already on the horizon. If silence could cost $700 million, David thought, what is the price of our own quiet acceptance? What would you do if you were seated in first class, your rights challenged, your presence questioned, yet your power unseen? That question lingered, hanging over the audience long after the story ended, daring them to confront their own decisions and the world they allowed to operate in the background. And for those watching, waiting, and learning, this wasn't the last flight, nor the last lesson. Subscribe to stay alert, because the skies still hold stories that demand attention. Don't let silence be your excuse.